This is Peter Cartier, Director of the Climate Emergency Institute, and I have another video of the COP26, United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. This is the Youth Day, gathered together in the middle of the city of Glasgow, chanting for climate justice. So I'm making this video on climate justice, a theme that we've heard actually for decades. Greta Thunberg has delivered two great speeches, one at the pre-COP Youth Conference in Milan. Of course, she made a speech at the Youth Day here in Glasgow. And I'm going to quote from that. "It is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. It should be obvious that we cannot solve the crisis with the same methods that got us into it in the first place. The COP has turned into a PR event where leaders are giving beautiful speeches and announcing fancy commitments and targets, while behind the curtains, governments of the global north countries are still refusing to take any drastic climate action." She also called COP26 a failure because world leaders who are calling for and saying that they are serious about action, Greta pointed out that, yeah, they're doing action, but it's all the absolutely wrong action. They're actively, she said, they actively choose to continue the exploitation of people and nature. She went on to say this is no longer a climate conference, it is a global north greenwashing conference, allowing the destruction of present and future living conditions to take place. One of the most impressive, certainly the most impressive for me and much of the media I noticed, was a speech given by a young lady from Kenya. And she actually gave the last speech at the opening plenary of COP26. And she made the point over and over. She pleaded to the leaders to open your hearts, feel what's happening to the people in my country. And then she said, maybe you'll come up with the right solutions for the first time. And she pointed out that children in her country and animals in her country are dying because of extreme weather event-driven droughts there. So is Greta right? Yeah, she's totally right. Totally right. So there's long speeches, and certainly Boris Johnson's opening speech on the James Bond Doomsday Machine was kind of entertaining and even appropriate, but all of the leaders are saying essentially the same thing. They're saying, we will, we commit, we pledge. Well, on climate change and global emissions, leaders have been pledging, promising, and committing ever since 1992, when the United Nations Climate Convention was signed. And here they are, in 2021 in Glasgow, giving all the young people the same bullshit. Yesterday, the Global Carbon Project annual scientific estimate was published. And this is the authoritative report on CO2 emissions and where they're coming from, what kind of emissions they are with respect to fossil fuels. And this is fossil fuel CO2 emissions. So this is a crucially important report. So in 1990 up to 2021, their projection, global emissions have increased 50%. Now, I'm going to stress 1990, the 1992 convention had very, very, very specific obligations on the industrially developed countries. And they had very specific obligations spelled out in detail on the most vulnerable countries. And as I've said before, they even had a long list naming the most vulnerable countries and regions. So checking the Global Carbon Project just released report and looking at 1990. In 1990, the emissions from the United States were double emissions from China. Now in 2020, it has reversed. Emissions from China are more than double the emissions of the United States. Additionally, the emissions from China are still increasing. Emissions from the United States, like the EU, are decreasing. Now, why am I explaining this? Because China is still being treated as it was in 1990. Despite the enormous amount of fossil fuel CO2 emissions that China has now reached, incomparably more than any other country, more than double the United States, and more than the OECD nations combined. Despite this, China is still being treated as it was in 1990 as a developing country. China's per capita fossil fuel CO2 emissions have also been increasing rapidly, and they have tripled in the past 2 decades, and now China's per capita CO2 emissions from fossil fuels is almost equal to the OECD average. Here we have an absurd reason, another reason for why COP26 is set up to fail. China's latest national emissions targets, which were communicated shortly before COP26, are still that China will not peak emissions until 2030. So rather than reducing emissions, China will increase emissions to 2030. Then China's promise is to have emissions put into decline, but only reaching zero by 2060. Now, we now have to look at a double-edged sword, although the side that we need to be on is pretty obvious. CO2 is cumulative. So all of these CO2 emissions that China is going to keep on increasing will build up the current level of CO2 in the atmosphere. So because of all these other countries' emissions are so relatively low compared to China, China's emissions are going to increase the total cumulative CO2 the most. And atmospheric CO2 at 416 parts per million is already the highest in millions of years. Even when China, if it keeps its promise, starts to decline its emissions, those emissions will still accumulate. What we have here is the biggest elephant in the COP negotiating room. The problem is that China is still being treated, as it was in 1990, as a developing country. China actually is part of a large group of developing countries and negotiates with them in the negotiations. According to the obvious science and the mathematics, this ridiculously outdated situation, as well as being absurd, is by far the greatest injustice. Now we'll see what this irrational treatment of China and China's emissions has on atmospheric CO2 concentration. So on the left here is the same Global Carbon Project graph of China's emissions, and on the right I've got atmospheric CO2 concentration from the Scripps Institute, also from 1990 and up to the present time, October 2021. You'll see that clearly over this entire period, atmospheric CO2 has been accelerating. So emissions will continue to increase, global emissions will continue to increase with China's up to 2030. And they will not reach 1990 levels until at least 2050. This means that atmospheric CO2 will continue to accelerate higher and higher and higher, at least for the next 25 years, if not longer. And that is the mathematics of global extinction. But clearly the negotiations should, as they were originally, should be focused on today's most climate vulnerable regions. And also, in that sense, all of the countries have to prioritize risks and impacts on today's children and on all future generations. In the 1992 UN Climate Change Convention, the very last sentence in the preamble preceding the agreements and requirements on all parties was this: determined to protect the climate system for present and future generations. So here's the other side of the cumulative CO2 emissions argument. Here we're looking at China and the OECD, their cumulative emissions. And as you see, from 2010 to 2019, although China's emissions are more than double those of the USA, the cumulative emissions are still increasing. However, the same is applying for the OECD. Because the OECD has high historic emissions, the OEC's cumulative emissions are way higher than those of China. It's impossible for China to catch up with OECD on cumulative emissions for decades and decades and decades. So what was in 1990 a very reasonable distinction between the Annex I industrially developed nations, long industrially developed nations, and the developing nations at that time has now become a fundamentally flawed reason why the negotiations cannot work, because they're being carried out on this now irrational basis. What we're looking at now is the latest one of these computer model projections, on this particular one on fossil fuel production. It was published in October of 2021. It's called the Fossil Fuel Production Gap Report, and you can see this is the 1.5 degree C path and this is the 2 degree C path. I've enlarged it a bit here. In both cases, global emissions, they had been in decline by 2020, and thereafter they have to decline rapidly. In his speech at COP26 in the opening plenary, the IPCC Chair, Dr. Hussein Lee, stated the following: global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during this century unless immediate, rapid, and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, especially of carbon dioxide and methane, occur in the nearest future. Increasing global emissions from now on is a global suicide scenario for the entire world. The industrial developed nations have never applied any of these commitments, requirements under the convention. Looking at the Global Carbon Project, fossil fuel CO2 emissions from 1980 up till now, it goes up and down a little bit, but the straight line trend is a constant, rapid increase. So what's going on here is the world economy. It is the world economy which is pouring fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere. Now, interestingly enough, today in the media, there was a report on a businessman who was one of the architects, apparently, of the Paris Agreement. And he made the most important statement, in a way, because without what he said we have to do, we're done for, nothing's going to happen. He said the economic system had to be totally transformed. So that really is an important thing. It was actually stated in equivalent terms in 2018 by the IPCC 1.5 degree C report, which said that for 1.5 C or 2 C, there had to be these immediate changes at all levels of society and all our activities. So you see, Greta ends her speech today by saying that this is a global north celebration of continued business as usual. We were told by many different United Nations conferences and statements that continued business as usual is not an option. I would like to mention Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the UN Climate Convention Office. And in her opening statement at COP26, she said this: "We stand at a pivotal point in history. Humanity faces several stark but clear choices. We either choose to achieve rapid and large-scale reductions of emissions to keep the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C, or we accept that humanity faces a bleak future on this planet." Here's the business as usual quote: "We either choose to recognize that business as usual isn't worth the devastating price we're paying and make the necessary transition to a more sustainable future, or we accept that we're investing in our own extinction." So this is another most important statement from the COP. So yes, Extinction Rebellion are absolutely right. You do get the impression from reading all the speeches that, yeah, everybody understands. We are on a fast track to extinction. The 1.5 degree C limit and the 2 degree C limit, I now want to say something about because they're highly pertinent to climate justice, or the unprecedented climate injustice, which is now against all the children in the world today. Not only children in Barbados, or in India, or in South America, or in Africa. Now we know, after the IPCC assessment this year, and after all the extreme record events that we had in the past 2 years, we're talking about our own children. So I'm, of course, a citizen of the global north, right? So for me, this is very personal. For me, it's the children in my life. That's why I do this. But today, it's all of the children everywhere. As I said in my previous video, at least every other day, I am getting an appeal in my mail for the situation in southern Madagascar. These appeals have been going on since June of this year. The people are in the first climate change famine. But how is it that the United Nations and the NGOs who collect money for food, how is it that they're still saying that these people are starving? We're talking about 1.5 million people. How is it? Greta was absolutely right. We live, obviously, painfully obviously, under a system that oppresses, exploits, and destroys. As she said, destroys livelihoods and destroys nature. The biosphere, nature, is unraveling at an unbelievably rapid rate due to the world economy. And this world economy is now bringing down the whole world. It's bringing down the entire planet. The only answer is, as Dr. Lee said, the IPCC chair, emissions have to be put into decline immediately, rapidly. There's nothing new about this. The IPCC has been saying this for a decade in terms of emissions had to be in decline at the very latest between 2015 and 2020. So this is nothing new. This is old science. The speeches were noticeable when I read them, that they actually have no action in them. They are calling for action, but no action in them. So what do I mean? Nothing that would put global emissions into decline in anything like the near future. So there's been this recent pre-COP synthesis, analysis by the UN Climate Secretariat of what will happen to global emissions with all the promises taken together. Not the present policies, which are far worse. If these promises, because they're not commitments anymore, they used to be commitments under the UN Climate Change Convention, but the global north has weaseled its way out of commitments, right? So over the years, since 1990, 92, these powerful, wealthy nations have watered down and watered down and watered down and made the most climate change vulnerable, and I'm talking billions of people, made them more vulnerable, more vulnerable, more vulnerable. So now we're in 2021. The countries in the global north should pay attention to this, because it's very clear from the last 2 years, for instance, the United States, the great United States, with the most highly successful food production in the world. It's incredibly successful. That food production is vulnerable because we've seen the heat waves over where the crops are grown, the breadbasket. We've seen the drought, which is a mega drought in the southwest of the United States. Over last summer, we saw this drought spreading up the middle of the United States, which is the heartland of agriculture, even up into Canada. The farmers growing the grains in Saskatchewan had huge losses this summer. So the injustice of the temperature targets. 2 degrees C had been the target limit until in actually the Copenhagen conference. Finally, after years after years after years of pleading at these conferences, the small island states and the most vulnerable said, look, they said, look to the other developed countries. We will not survive at 2 degrees C. We would be totally wiped out. So finally in Copenhagen, they sort of made a note and said, well, we'll look at that, okay? And Copenhagen was in 2009. It took 10 years, it took a decade, right, for it to be looked at, examined by the scientists, and for us to make the conclusion, no, 2C is absolute global catastrophe. 1.5 C is bad enough. For those who read in some detail 1.5 degree C IPCC report, if you haven't, that is the most important report to read. The IPCC did an excellent job on that report. And you can compare charts with what's going to happen at 1.5 degrees C to coastal regions, to food security, to water security, to health and diseases. You can read what's going to happen at 1.5 degrees C and you'll see it's disastrous. 1.5 degrees C is a disastrous planet. A completely different planet to what we have all been used to and grown up with. Completely different. 2 degrees C is way worse. 2 degrees C, we have billions of people without access to drinkable water anymore. We have billions of people whose crops are in decline year after year after year, and year after year after year they're declining faster. We have more people suffering from horrible diseases like malaria, dengue. That's a world of 2 degrees C. It's a completely unthinkable world. 1.5 degrees C, as I stress, is going to be a very rough ride for everybody in all countries, but particularly for all our children today. The impression was given overall that we were looking at something really bad in the future, and that in the future these leaders were going to fix it for us. That's the overall impression, which, as Greta said, is the big PR of COP26. Every year that we allow our leaders to get away with all the PR bullshit that they're getting away with, it gets far worse year by year for everyone, the families of the mega rich included. I think it was in a COP back in 2010 that the then chair of the IPCC made the statement that no one is going to escape from the impacts of climate change, which are now inevitable, which are now unavoidable. So people of the global north really, really need to wake up. They really need to listen to what the smart people like Greta Thunberg, and there are now thousands of Gretas around the world. People of my generation have to make sure that this whole terrible oppressive exploitive system, which dates back to, European monarchies and colonizers, and you could read that history and it's really horrible, is completely transformed, like the businessman was reported as saying today, and like the young people are also saying. You know the slogan? Not climate change, system change. Very simply, that's what we have to do. And all of these lengthy, and yeah, they were well-written speeches. I mean, when you're sort of impressive, okay? But none of those speeches, none of those commitments do anything to transform the economic system. Nothing whatsoever. So you've read about progress at Glasgow, COP26. You've read about what the leaders are calling the Glasgow breakthroughs. They always have a great buzzword, a great label for these big COPs, right? Have they said that they are going to end the biggest evil of all, which is an evil by governments, which is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to extract more fossil fuels to be burned? Did anybody mention that in COP26? No. No. Interestingly enough, a couple of weeks before the COP26, the wealthy countries of the world, the G20, who are responsible for 85% of emissions, Africans are really responsible for next to no emissions at all. Those people in Madagascar are responsible for next to no emissions at all. Those people who are dying, who are actually being killed by our economic system and by climate change, right? Shortly before COP26, the big money G20 government leaders met at a summit in Rome on the 31st of October. And in this statement, incredibly, they are still not planning on terminating fossil fuel subsidies. Down in item 27, they say this: we will increase our efforts to implement the commitment made in 2009 in Pittsburgh to phase out and rationalize over the medium term inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption, and commit to achieve this objective while providing targeted support for the poorest and most vulnerable. My God, they made this commitment in 2009. So what an example of what these big economy governments mean when they commit to this, that, and the other, as they have in COP26 in Glasgow. This statement, with no date whatsoever, and going back to 2009, clearly means that they have no intention of ever stopping their fossil fuel subsidies, even though they know that total world fossil fuel subsidies now amount to $5.9 trillion. Yes, that was the latest assessment in September of this year, 2001, by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that Total global fossil fuel subsidies now amount to about $6 trillion a year. Governments pouring our tax money into more fossil fuel extraction to burn so that our children have no future, right? And I mean no future. Well, not a future worth living, that's for sure. They also had the number, of course, of 2050 for net zero emissions. Now, I think many people, certainly these young people, know that net zero is completely phony. They know that. They understand that, you know. The NGOs, I must say, made a really good policy statement for COP26. They said, no net zero. Stop talking about net zero. It has to be true, what they call real zero. Okay? Net zero is just a way of these wealthy, powerful governments getting away with not reducing their emissions. I've been involved in decades in environmental health protection, assessment and policy. So I know for sure that under our system, nothing happens with environmental pollution because, of course, climate change is the result of the worst pollution ever, okay? And I just want to point out how bad this pollution is. It's not only destroying the lives of billions of people in the near future. Fossil fuel air pollution is killing over 10 million people a year. That is, by our own European standard of evil, which I don't have to mention, okay, that's the same number of that horrific event that happened in Europe when my father fought against, right? Every year, 10 million vulnerable people killed as a result of fossil fuel air pollution. And the fossil fuel corporations and the banks are still pouring money into more fossil fuel air pollution. So I know that nothing happens in our system unless there is government regulation, government legislation. Because I can look back at all of the global environmental crises, starting with Minamata in Japan in the 1960s. And the result has always been the same. And Greta is right, and her young friends are right, when she says the solutions and the corrections only come from the people. Every single huge regional, horrible environmental pollution situation, Love Canal in the United States, for example, there are many of them. What happened, and I've lived to see it happen, was that some intelligent, very ordinary people realized that there was something really bad going on. And they found it, oh, it's from this industry, okay? So they got together and they lobbied and they had protests, okay? The women were always in the lead, by the way, so Greta's not unusual in that regard. And the governments only paid attention on what I have to call a body count. It was only when the so-called activists, right, the people trying to get the right thing done, it was only when they faced and forced their governments to face the deaths that had occurred over years and years and years of this particular pollution. Then governments regulated. They did. And it takes an average, because I've looked over it, as I say, in my lifetime, it takes an average of 20 years for that to happen. And there are many, many, lead in gasoline, I mean, I could go on and on, dioxins and furans, you know, could go on and on, right? We're way over that on the most deadly pollution from industry and from our industrial perverse economy ever. We're poisoning the air. Our economy is poisoning the air. It is poisoning the oceans at a phenomenal rate. So until I see these governments passing legislation or even proposing to pass legislation. Their commitments, their promises, and their pledges mean not a damn thing. They mean that they're still condemning humanity to death. On the issue of climate justice or injustice, I can do no better than to end this video with some extracts from the speech given by Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, at the opening of the World Leaders Summit.
We come to Glasgow with global ambition to save our people and to save our planet. On mitigation, climate pledges or NDCs, without more, we will leave the world on a pathway to 2.7 degrees, and with more, we are still likely to get to 2 degrees. These commitments, made by some, are based on technologies yet to be developed. On finance, we are $20 billion short of the $100 billion, and this commitment, even then, might only be met in 2023. On adaptation, adaptation finance remains only at 25%, not the 50-50 split that was promised nor needed given the warming that is already taking place on this earth. Climate finance to frontline small island developing states declined by 25% in 2019. Failure to provide the critical finance and that of loss and damage is measured, my friends, in lives and livelihoods in our communities. This is immoral and it is unjust. So I ask to you, what must we say to our people living on the front line in the Caribbean, in Africa, in Latin America, in the Pacific? And are we really going to leave Scotland without the resolve and the ambition that is sorely needed to save lives and to save our planet? How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity? Leaders must not fail those who elect them to lead. And I say to you, there is a sword that can cut down this Gordian knot, and it has been wielded before. The central banks of the wealthiest countries engaged in $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. 25 trillion. Of that, 9 trillion was in the last 18 months to fight the pandemic. Had we used that 25 trillion to purchase bonds, to finance the energy transition, or the transition of how we eat, or how we move ourselves in transport, we would now today be reaching that 1.5 degrees limit that is so vital to us. And if our existence is to mean anything, then we must act in the interests of all of our people who are dependent on us. And if we don't, we will allow the path of greed and selfishness to sow the seeds of our common destruction. The leaders of today, not 2030, not 2050, must make this choice. It is in our hands, and our people and our planet need it more than ever. Code red to the G7 countries. Code red to the G20. Earth to COP, that's what it said. Earth to COP. For those who have eyes to see, for those who have ears to listen, and for those who have a heart to feel, 1.5 is what we need to survive. 2 degrees, yes, SG, is a death sentence for the people of Antigua and Barbuda, for the people of the Maldives, for the people of Dominica and Fiji, for the people of Kenya and Mozambique, and yes, for the people of Samoa and Barbados. We do not want that dreaded death sentence. And we've come here today to say, try harder, because our people, the climate army, the world, the planet, needs our actions now, not next year, not in the next decade. Thank you.